done work at MIT Media Lab, Anthropic, and One Day Sooner. In his spare time, he enjoys swing dancing and sailing. And he will give a talk on what if tech policy wasn't terrible, careers in and around government.
Thank you. So, I imagine that some of you have likely observed the US government doing things. Yes? Okay, glad to know that you have eyes, because it does a lot of things. Many of those things matter. It's useful to pay attention to it. So, what if it did better things instead of worse things? Wouldn't that be nice? Do it. I know, easy applause line. So, the thing is that it is actually really hard to do things. You would be amazed how difficult it is to do things, let alone to do better things rather than worse things. It's really surprisingly difficult. I know it sounds like a cop-out, but genuinely, it's hard. We need help. Part of the reason that tech policy is so bad is that we don't always know what we're doing. And you'd think, oh, can't you just Google this? But it turns out you need to know the thing that you need to Google. If you don't know the keyword, if you don't know the term, if you don't know that a concept even exists, it's hard to just Google it. So it's actually really useful to have people who understand what they're talking about. And if you want to discuss a lot of important policy questions, it turns out engineers know what they're talking about and have answers to important things. And so that's why policymaking needs engineers, and I'm here to pitch you on this role. So, about me, I am not an engineer. I apologize for this. It has led to many problems in my life. I don't know why you're applauding this, but fair enough. I was a philosophy, politics, and economics major, which is okay. All right, glad to hear this up on the house. Like many of the sensible ones, I dabbled a little in Python, which has proved extremely useful in my time since. And now I'm at the RAND Corporation, which stands for Research and Development. We don't actually do as much of that these days as we used to, which is a little sad. But it's been an interesting place, and it's certainly got a strong engineering history. The first report we ever published was a very, very, very proto-examination of what would a spaceship like. It's a report on the world-circling ship, we called it at the time. And that's the thing. If you're trying to think through what does getting to space mean policy-wise, if you're the government, you're trying to understand what does it mean to be able to suddenly go to space, it's pretty useful to have people who understand, like, how does a rocket work? What is a rocket equation? Why is weight important when you're thinking about putting things in space? These are actually very important questions, let alone a whole bunch of questions about material sciences. For example, I've done work looking at where are concentrations of rare earth minerals that are useful for all sorts of engineering purposes, right? Because you want to be able to make semiconductors, you want to be able to make fighter jets, you want to be able to make all sorts of useful things that rely on certain minerals. And if you ask someone, which minerals are useful, which minerals are likely to be useful, what things are important, you kind of need engineers to be able to give you useful answers on most of that. So this is the sort of thing that I'm talking about. Policy is important. People talk about having millions of users, and I'm very happy for them. Federal government has 330 million direct users in some meaningful sense, but also there is no one on this planet whose life is not affected by the policy decisions of the US government. When the US government chooses to subsidize American farmers, that affects farmers everywhere else, it turns out. When the US government decides where will we invade, where will we support, what will we do, the US government, it doesn't really have 330 million users. It has 330 million paying users and 7.7 billion non-paying users. And as you are aware, often the non-paying users are less important to the relevant organization, but I still care about them. I think many of you might also care about them. So yeah, if you want to work at the organization with the most users, you can come here. It's not all good, but I think it does some important work. $1.7 is, you know, trillion Big number, yeah, $1.7 trillion. That's the discretionary budget. That's the stuff that we get to play around with every year. I'm not even touching Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid. These are a massive, massive organization. And it's run by 535 voting members of Congress, one president. How many judges you want to count depends on the day, week, month, decade. But that's not actually a huge number. That's a couple of people who are having a lot of trouble trying to keep track of everything that's happening. And so they need support. And sometimes they get that support through tracking, okay, what's going on, what is the government doing from the government. And there are various organizations and agencies that exist to support Congress. And a lot of them do really good work, and a lot of them have been cut pretty dramatically. I'm not sure if you're aware, but it turns out that Congress spending money on itself is not the most popular thing. I know, right? You can't imagine why. Congress having a 13% approval rating. Some reason they say, hey, we want to spend more money. People are like, no, we don't like this. The problem is that when you do this for decade after decade, what gets slashed is the staffers. What gets slashed is all of the people who used to work in Congress and had critical institutional expertise, and now, you're offering 30K salaries. And people say, okay, I can do that for 3 years, and then I'm gonna need to move on, because at some point I would like to imagine having a house. Not that I'll actually ever have one, but I would like to imagine it. It's the fantasy that's important. And so when Congress loses that capacity, I think that's a bad thing. I want you to consider working as a congressional staffer, but I recognize that it's a difficult sell because of the whole 30K thing I mentioned, and it was pretty bad. So it's good work, I believe in it. I work in a think tank, and that's more of what I'm pitching. So the think tanks do the thinking for the US government. I don't want to say that it's zero good policy. A lot of people in the federal agencies do a lot of good work. But a lot of new ideas, a lot of new concepts get developed and refined by think tanks before they're able to show up. Because the federal agencies, they're trying to deal with today. They'll think about tomorrow. They'll try to plan for a few years out. But when they're saying, what could be, what can we imagine, what's 5 years, what's 10 years, what's 30 years out? Well, for one thing, if you do too much speculative stuff, someone in Congress says, hey, they're wasting money doing all this speculative stuff that doesn't actually happen. And it's difficult to explain, yeah, we care about the hypotheticals because they might happen, but the other thing you can do is you have think tanks do it. So think tanks are where you're going to see people actually making future policy. You're not usually directly writing the laws. What you're doing is trying to come up with new ideas. When you see people talking about a child tax credit, that's an idea that got workshopped for decades in think tanks, long before it ever hit Congress. When you see people debating over, okay, what would cap and trade versus a carbon tax look like, that gets debated by and large in think tanks long before it's able to hit the public. Ideas get generated and shaped and formed in think tanks, and then they hit the public consciousness. So if you want to have the most impact over what ideas get shaped, how fast the bad ones die off and the good ones spread, think tanks are a pretty good place to work. So hopefully that's the adequate pitch, but I will certainly answer more questions if you want. Getting the role. So as I mentioned, we really need engineers. We really need people who understand the physical world. And there is going to be more specific points. There are always details, but the one thing you actually need to do to get a think tank job, assuming you're already a good engineer, I'm like, of course, you have a good GPA, do impressive projects, generally all that cool resume building stuff you've heard 1,000 other times, that any career service will be able to tell you. But if you want to get a think tank job, you need a good writing sample. They will ask you for something, typically 10 to 20 pages. I think it's good to have a 10-page version and a 20-page version, but if you have one that's 15, you'll be able to get away with it most of the time. So have that writing sample. That sample should be about policy. A 15-page writing sample that's about something random, they don't care as much. Then the other thing you want is that it should be good. Please make it good. I have had to eject people because I have looked at their writing and I've said, I don't want you to write. I don't want to have to edit your writing. I don't want to have to rewrite everything that you've written. Please, make it a good writing sample. Put the effort in, and then once you've made it a good writing sample that's about policy, see if you can get it published somewhere. There's a lot of media outlets that are very happy to take free labor, it turns out. I don't know if you've heard, but journalism has been having some trouble with money in the past few decades. So if you can provide them with free content, congratulations. Your writing sample is now a published piece at wherever. Also, you get a free editor who will look at it and knows what they're doing and can give you advice on how to revise it. And it's still your piece. You're still the author. So that's the basic writing sample pitch, but I don't want to ignore the federal government. There is a great deal of demand for it, as you can see. 100,000 people just in DoD, whole bunch in a bunch of other agencies, really across everyone. How many engineers do you think work in the Department of Justice? Turns out about 4,000 at the moment, right? That's not a small number. That is people who are doing important work, answering important questions. Because you have to be able to say, like, hey, is this entire field of criminology worth anything? Sometimes it turns out the answer is no. So it's good to have engineers who can look at physical facts and give reliable information. And yeah, it turns out the Department of Justice needs that. A bunch of others I can talk sort of roughly about how what they do interacts with needs. But if you really want to, well, here's a list of where people are engineers. Defense Nuclear Facilities Safety Board. Hopefully I don't have to explain why it is good that there are good engineers working at the Defense Nuclear Facilities Safety Board. That seems like the sort of thing where you would want to have high quality engineers. So if you think, I should apply, because if I'm better than the next person, if I'm better than the alternative, I really want to be working there, right? Turns out that sort of thing, I at least think is fairly important. So yeah, also general engineering, electronics, technical, mechanical, civil is rough order of demand. I don't want to say there's nothing, but I think I'm not going to be pitching to an audience who are saying, I want to take my aeronautical engineering expertise and work for the Department of Defense. It's just my sense of the crowd. So I also want to say that it's not that I'm asking you to change careers. I am saying, hey, take the skills that you've developed and use them in this area. I'm not saying it will necessarily be the highest application of all of these skills that you necessarily run into. Some people get to do really technical econometrics. Honestly, the last math that I did seriously was saying, okay, how do we do a two-proportion z-test again? And I googled that, and I was like, all right, yep, I remember, awesome. On the other hand, that let me know the difference between AI-enabling technology exports and AI exports in China is not statistically significant between democracies and non-democracies. That's a research question that, like, I'm kind of glad we're able to answer, that we can say, hey, what's going on here, and actually have at least that level of skill. And it turns out the more you know, the more you're able to say, hey, we can also do this, we can also do this, we can ask this other question. Second thought, understanding how the physical world works. So, who here has heard of LK99? All right, some of you need to get out from under your rock. There's a possibility of a superconductor, an actual functioning superconductor. Now, who here can give me one implication of a superconductor that might be relevant to a policymaker? I'm not going to call on you. You won't have to answer, just raise your hand if you feel like you know something or could figure something out. Awesome. Now, that's not the only issue, and I said I wouldn't call on you, so I won't ask, but do you see how it would be useful for policymakers to be able to say, hey, what happens if this turns out to work? What do we need to do differently? If we think that superconductors, maybe this isn't one, but we're more likely to find a superconductor in the next 5 years than I thought, what would that change? How should I be planning differently? What does the federal government or state government need to be doing differently in terms of infrastructure investments? What does future power demand look like if we have working superconductors? These are questions that engineers are equipped to answer, and frankly, no one else really is. I mentioned that I'm not an engineer, so what I am semi-frequently doing is talking to people that I call my technical experts, who are engineers, who in turn are gathering from a bunch of other engineers who actually work with the real products and summarizing what they say. Because I can't understand the people who are actually working on developing semiconductors. They're talking technical things that are just babble to me, and I'm like, I cannot understand this. But they can talk to an engineer who can understand them. I can hear them and translate that, and then I can prepare something for a policymaker. And this is a fairly common number of layers in between working on physical reality and where policymakers are able to understand. The more people in between who are trained engineers, who understand what they're talking about, who have a relevant background in these physical sciences, the more people who can say, yes, this is going to get transmitted correctly, as opposed to incorrectly. Because if you want to know how a lot of bad policy happens, it's because people in the middle, people working at think tanks, people like me, people potentially like you, got something wrong. So please, don't get them wrong. I would hate to do that. And of course, if you can do any data analysis, if you can present something in a nice way, if you can make a map that looks good, there's a lot of demand in policy for that sort of thing. So that's the talk. Hopefully I have both convinced you that it is worth going into policy roles and given you a little bit of thought on how that's possible. But I know there's a lot more ground here, so I am now taking questions. Woo!
I was kind of curious about your opinion as to our current congressmen. Clearly there's some in our Congress that are a bit more biased towards certain policy decisions and information. So can you speak to more about how they receive information from those think tanks?
Sure. So, yeah, everyone is biased. Some people are more biased. I don't think that any amount of engineering expertise is, well, no, this talk's being recorded. So, I will say that everyone has to deal with how do you present information to someone who has their preconceptions. If you do corporate work, you will also, at some point in time, run into a boss who knows that they know how things really work. And part of working in policy is knowing that you're not going to change everything overnight. A lot of the value really is recognizing 330 million paying recognized voting users, 7.7 billion more besides, and saying that a very small win multiplied over that entire population can really matter. You can go years without actually getting anything done, and that is something that you have to be ready for if you want to work at the federal level. And then you will have a month and you will say, okay, yeah, I just saved 200 lives, if my math is correct, because I made a point and I fought for something, and I had the credibility, and I knew the people, and I was able to get something changed.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for the talk. It was really informative. I was curious about when you're talking about the need for engineers kind of in between, like in these think tanks to provide a lot of help for that decision making. Where do you see like the role of like AI or like even like LLMs, which are I guess very much in vogue now? Do you see that as being something that people are considering for taking kind of large amounts of data and being able to synthesize them quicker than is done traditionally, or is that something that people are still kind of apprehensive about?
data synthesis is really useful. We actually already have an internally developed LLM where you can type in a natural language question and get all of the reports that our nonprofit has authored over the past 2 decades. And so that gets you relevant citations. And that's really useful. I find that very handy. AI is helpful. That said, AI is wrong some fraction of the time. That fraction of the time is currently much higher than is tolerable. And a lot of the benefit of having a model, at least in my uses, is that it's like having a thoughtful, reasonably competent friend who you can ask questions of and will give you answers. They will look at your essay, they will look at your email, and they'll say, hey, did you miss this thing? Did you have that thing? But when I get my best work edited, I like it to be by very competent friends who really know their stuff. We're not there today. I have just had disagreements with people about whether current model architectures are ever capable of getting us to there. Mostly sort of, do you think that mean text response is capable of giving useful results? I argue that we can get improvements from there. Other people say, no, we're going to need a whole different system. But it's not something that I'm very confident on. I expect existing systems to get better. We're still going to need engineers. I think that understanding how to write good prompts is useful, but as one recent paper proved, GPT-3, or maybe it was 4, is an excellent prompt engineer. You can say, hey, what is a good prompt for answering this question, and get a better prompt out of it. So, yeah, right now, it's helpful some of the time. It's still useful to be able to tell, hey, that's wrong. Hey, that's not quite right. You can use it for first drafts, but you don't want to use it for final essays. For that, you still need to know what you're doing.
Hi, that was a really great talk. I just really wanted to ask if you can kind of dive deeper into I guess the job that as a person who works at a think tank does. So kind of how does you have an issue, how do you guys come together and discuss it, and then you come up with solutions, you argue, how does that I guess transform itself into real laws or policies? How does that process go?
So that's, to some extent, 2 different questions, and I will separate them out and answer both, because they're both very good ones. What does my day-to-day life look like as a think tank employee? Most people will have 1 or more projects. The projects will typically terminate in reports, papers, white papers, something in that range. Typically in the 20 to 150 page range. Yes, they do range that entire area, and also you'd be really surprised how much writing you can turn out at the end of a research project. You're like, how are we going to fit this? And it's like, yeah, so can we do 80 pages? Can we fit it inside that? Maybe not. No, really, it's surprising how much you can write when you're actually trying to explain a complicated technical concept to people who don't necessarily have any background, and you shove most of that into the appendix. Appendices are very useful, but no, I'm trying to answer a question about what does my day-to-day life look like. I've got 1 to 5 projects at a time. I'm trying to answer some question about the world, which might include we surveyed experts, we surveyed ordinary people, we thought all about the problem very hard, we ran some modeling and simulation efforts, a whole wide variety of ways to try to analyze some questions. Sometimes it's go read 5,000 medical papers. I have personally read 2,000 papers on vaccine safety. It wasn't a pleasant experience, but you know what? I learned a lot, and I think the paper that we did was good work. I also think that then it's sort of, you're working on the projects, you're doing research, you're writing, you're editing, you're pumping them out. So that's part 1. Part 2, how does all this think tank work turn into actual law? It varies. who writes a law is usually not think tank employees. That said, sometimes it kind of is. Like, people will ask, hey, can you give us a sample law or model law? And then you look 6 months later and you're like, oh yeah, I recognize that phrase. So that's not always, and it's, very tricky to track to specific examples. You will write something and then you will hear back, oh yeah, no, that concept went in. But it's sometimes possible to see how the idea went through. So yeah, sometimes you're responding to congressional requests from someone in senator or member of whatever's office to give them some sort of sample. More often, I mentioned that think tanks are idea generators. Staffers read what think tanks say. They spend a fair bit of time, if they walk on the legislative side, actually trying to understand, yeah, what should we do here? Also, a lot of it is that the common sentiment is that a lot of the value of the report is not in the actual document, which will barely be read. It's in the actual work to prepare it and then having that expertise on hand. Because, okay, war in Ukraine has broken out. The 200-page documents that you wrote, no one has time for those. But you know what they do have time for? My colleague, Ed Geist, who has worked on a lot of these and can now answer questions and gets called in. And everyone's like, okay, goodbye. We won't stress you about projects for a while. It's all good. You're going to be busy helping people make policy because you understand the area and the problem. And I could go through a number of my colleagues about that one. So yeah, developing expertise that the federal government can call on in different ways is a lot of what we do.
All right, we'll take 1 or 2 more questions.
Hi. So the answer to your last question kind of got me thinking. So where does the initial push for new projects and ideas come from normally in these think tanks? And how is work normally assigned? Like, I want to do this project, and I don't want to do this project. So I guess it's 2 questions. So where does the initial ideas come from, and how do you split up work?
So that varies a lot depending on the think tank. RAND is notable for having almost all of its work directed by various, mostly government clients who want a specific answer to a specific question. Upside, it means that we know that when we do work, it's because someone cares about the answer. You would not believe how much work gets done and is not actually answering the right question and is thus functionally worthless. Downside, we don't entirely get to choose what we work on. And so there's often a bit of negotiation with clients where we say, we think this question is more important. And often they say yes and they'll listen to us because we've got that reputation. Sometimes they say no. And then in terms of what you get to work on, again, it varies depending on the think tank. So some think tanks, it's more, okay, you work in this area, and then you work with this person, and so whatever they're doing, you're doing. Sometimes you get to pick your projects. That's how it works for me. Sometimes it's semi-negotiated, where you say, hey, I'm interested in this. They say, all right, you can do a little bit of time on that, but we mostly need you on this thing. So yeah, a lot of variance between think tanks, but it's definitely worth thinking about. Yeah, I think I am supposed to end right now, so I want to say if you have any more questions, I am happy to reach out to me either here or kellershoal.com has a bunch of ways to get in contact with me. Thank you very much.